talking about this idea of the bureaucracy shrinking, or not technically growing. And I said that can be a little bit deceiving. So an example would be, like as a percentage of the total workforce, no more people work for the federal government. But what we have is we have a lot of people who work for companies who are then hired to work for the federal government. So the example I was going to give you, so Ms. Decker's husband, he's like an engineer, and they do like military goods. So like he's worked for Raytheon, or he works for this other company in Dallas now. So he basically works for the Department of Defense, but doesn't work for the Department of Defense, nor has he ever, but like he's always worked in that capacity. I remember several people that have done that. I mean, Coach Thompson was telling me, like for years, his wife works for a company called Colgate, that makes like toothpaste and all that kind of stuff. So like her biggest contract, her biggest company is the Air Force. And so she like sells to the Air Force. So there's a thing, there's just kind of like when you learn in economics about privatization and globalization and sending jobs different places, there is a lot of that where the federal government outsources things. They have private contractors or private companies do things. So it's a little bit deceiving in that sense. But regardless, when you look at this chart, as a percentage of the overall workforce, this represents, the pink represents the federal government, so it's less than 2%. And since the 70s, it hasn't really changed. This is our state, and actually most people are employed by local government, which would include school districts. So that's why that's going to be so big. Okay? All right. Here's what I want you to do really quickly. We're gonna skip question 2 just because we're kind of struggling a little bit, and we're going to get into the structure of the bureaucracy. That's going to be really important, and then I'll give you some time on your own to go back and answer those other questions. So our national government is organized into 5 parts. It is going to be important that you know these 5 parts, and we're going to have examples of each. And kind of like what you need to know or what you need to remember is that each of these different parts, when a person works in a cabinet versus the EOP or a government corporation instead of a regulatory agency, that does affect their ability to impact policy. So the structure relates to who will be more influential and who will be less influential. So I'm going to draw a diagram really quickly, and then I'll go back to this if that's okay. And then that way we can kind of see how this is all going to fit.
Wait, would you say just now the structure relates?
The structure, like where your agency fits in relationship to the structure, will often determine like how influential you're able to be over policy. Okay? All right, let's focus. All right, so here we go. We have, who is in charge of the executive branch? President. Okay, so all of the bureaucracy is going to account to the president, and it's organized into 3 parts. Okay, you have the executive office of the presidency, and I'm going to go over what that is shortly. Okay, you have the cabinet or the departments, Department of Defense, Department of State, Department of Treasury. Then you have independent agencies. But there are 3 different kinds of independent agencies. Some of them are regulatory. Some of them are simply just executive agencies, and I'm going to explain the difference in all of these, promise. And then you actually have some that are government corporations. So they're literally like they're businesses, but the government owns them. Okay? So, like I said earlier, like if you were a person that said, I really want to I want to work for the government. I want to make some difference. I want to kind of impact something somehow, some way. Where you go and work will definitely determine how influential you're going to be. Some jobs are more prestigious, some are less prestigious, but there's definitely like a lot of opportunity there. Okay, so let's go back to this then. So here are your 5 parts. Okay, so the cabinet would represent like all of the ones that say department. Independent executive agencies are going to be like NASA, and I'll explain what that is in a minute, or what it does. Independent regulatory agencies, that would be like right here, the United States Sentencing Commission, which we're not going to talk about them again, but government corporations is like the FDIC. And then the executive office of the presidency, that's just like the president's closest advisors. And so the National Security Agency. So I'm going to go through each slide. I'm going to talk to you about what happens there, how you get to be there. Here's what I would encourage you to do. You'll never memorize all of the bureaucracy. Think about what area of policy is interesting to you that you are likely to remember, and that's the example I would write down. So I would know like 2 regulatory agencies, 2 cabinets, 2 government corporations, and then hopefully those are the ones that will show up on your test. Typically on the AP exam, they'll give you choice. Like they'll give you like an opportunity to write, but they'll give you several to choose from, and most always, and I'll tell you the ones that they tend to ask you about. So we're going to start with the cabinet agencies. This is really like the oldest part of the bureaucracy. From the very beginning, the Constitution doesn't create this, but it does mention in Article 2, it says something about presidential advisors. So Washington, from the very beginning, created 3 cabinet departments. We have a Department of State, we have a Treasury Department, and we have a Department of Defense. So every president subsequently have had these. So the president and the Congress work together to create these cabinets. You can kind of think like the people that lead these are the people we call the secretary. So Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Commerce. The only one that's not called that is the person that leads the Department of Justice. Do you know what we call them? Have you ever heard somebody say Attorney General before? So the Attorney General is the Secretary of Justice. So, but the rest of them are all called that Secretary. How do secretaries and or the Attorney General get their job? Appointment by the President and confirmation by the Senate. That's super important. You have to remember that, because what that tells you right there is that not only are they going to be presidential advisors, but they're also going to have some kind of accountability to Congress. I kind of think of these people like managers for their area of policy. Okay, so if we put that in the context of Centennial High School. So if you put Miss Mayfie's up here, Dr. Mayfie's up here, all of the different departments within the school have a department head. And so like I'm over the social studies department. Mr. Scroggins is over the math department. Whenever we have a meeting and Dr. Mayfie's is trying to make some kind of decision about a policy, she'll ask my perspective, she'll ask Mr. Scroggins' perspective. Well, very often he and I don't agree. It's not because we don't like each other, but because he's a math teacher, and math teachers are so different than social studies teachers, right? And we have different needs and kind of different expectations of what should happen. So, but we are advising Dr. Mayfie's from our perspective, our area of policy, how it impacts us. And that's kind of what happens here. So that person the person who's the Secretary of Agriculture, his or her job is to advise the president about agriculture policy, to advance agriculture policy, and then also to oversee everything. So they're like a manager, basically, because there are different agencies that fall underneath that. You can also kind of see a correlation to when they were created. Housing and Urban Development in 1965 as part of the Civil Rights Movement. Department of Energy in 1977. You guys might remember we had this huge energy crisis in the 70s with inflation and unemployment. Department of Homeland Security was the last one that was created in response to 9/11. So typically you'll see like some kind of correlation. Here's one thing to remember, just a little bit of trivia. So all of these people are in line to succeed the president. So if the president, the vice president, the speaker, and the pro tem were all killed at the same time, okay? Or all simultaneously had a heart attack. Then what we do is we go to the cabinet, and they're there they're in line to the presidency in order of creation. So the last person in line to the presidency, behind all 17 others, would be the Secretary of Homeland Security. And I guess another little bit of trivia, they're never all allowed to be in the same place at the same time. So the cabinet can be, but they can't also be there with the speaker and the pro tem. So like you'll hear, if you watch the State of the Union in February, they'll make a big deal about how one of the cabinet secretaries is being kept somewhere else just in case someone decides to blow us up, then that person can be president.
Didn't they make a show about that?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, that's right, they sure did. That new one. Yes. Designated Survivor. Yeah. I haven't watched it yet though. I don't
What is that guy? Oh, but
I don't know.
He's from 24. My fiance's obsessed with
Kiefer
him.
Sutherland. But do you know what his job, like what his position is?
No. Is he just like
Ooh, y'all could do that. Y'all could do that for your class application grade this last 6 weeks, huh?
Wow, 6 weeks.
I know, can you believe it? 6 weeks
Oh
almost
my
over.
goodness.
Okay. All right, so let's move on to the next part. Then you have independent agencies. The most well-known independent agency is NASA, because everybody knows about NASA, right? Like NASA's fun, NASA's exciting. Independent agencies are independent because they don't fit anywhere else. What they do is super unique, or we don't want it to get mired up in the politics of something else. So if you think about NASA, some of the things that they do are research oriented, some are defense, some are education, some are exploration, some are science. Like you could actually take what they do and fit them within a lot of different cabinets. If you were to put them under the Department of Defense, though, doesn't that change what you think about NASA as? Because now suddenly it becomes a defense-oriented agency, whereas now it's just cool NASA. Like it's just its own thing. So typically independent agencies are less about policy making, and they're more about just performing some kind of government service that typically we don't think of as very political. Good? Can I keep going?
Mhm.
Okay. All right. Regulatory agencies. These, for your purposes, are probably the most important. Okay? The reason would be because regulatory agencies possess police power. A regulatory agency can show up somewhere and they can assess consequences and fines for people who are not following with the law. The Environmental Protection Agency would be an example. The Federal Reserve, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Communications Commission. Have y'all ever heard of Guns N' Roses? Yeah. Okay. So back in my day, Guns N' Roses was getting it was a Grammys. It was like one year, like when the huge album, like they were winning tons of awards. It was on TV, and every time they'd go up on stage, they would drop f-bombs. I mean, it was like awful, terrible, terrible, terrible. And that was before they did tape delay. So every single one of those were on TV. So the FCC possesses the ability to fine them because you're not allowed to say that on broadcast television. So they can go in and they can say, well, we're going to fine you and we're going to fine the network for what you did. A couple years ago, Janet Jackson, there was that whole wardrobe malfunction. Were y'all too young for that? You don't know? Okay. Janet Jackson, she danced at the Super Bowl, and part of her costume came off. And so it was a wardrobe malfunction. So like the Federal Communications Commission can fine her and the network for that, because the Federal Communications Commission can decide what is okay to be said, seen, done, whatever on television. Okay? So regulatory agencies. Why do you think I say that these are more important for you to know than, say, independent agencies? In relationship to what we study in this class. Oh, come on.
They're closer to the government. I mean, the political part of it.
Okay, you're really close. What is every time we study something in this class, what do we always relate it back to?
Oh, what was it? No, it was the word federalism.
We may have to start all over again.
Federalism.
Public policy,
Oh.
right? We always say you have this power, how do you make policy? You have this power, how do you make policy? So I'll ask my question again. Why would regulatory agencies, say, be more important for you as an AP government student to know about than independent agencies?
Public policy.
Okay, but what about public policy?
They deal more with public policy.
Do you see how they really can kind of create it in a lot of ways?
Yeah.
Okay, Congress made the law. Congress said pass the Clean Air Act, but the EPA is charged with carrying the Clean Air Act out. Well, if the Clean Air Act says you have to protect air quality by blah 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 blah, it doesn't give every detail in terms of how that's going to be carried out. So regulatory agencies have immense power in terms of enforcement of policy. Good?
So like the EPA is an example of regulatory.
Yes. I would say you should know the EPA, you should know the Federal